Steve Shafer, who needs little introduction to most of us in the room. Steve's a professor both at Stanford and at UCSF, so he bridges that divide. I'll let him talk a little bit more about his relationship with TED, because I want this to be all about TED today.
So it's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Mike, for the introduction, and nice to see so many of TED's colleagues and friends and family who have traveled so hard to be here. I'm not going to actually speak. Instead, I have here one of the drafts now in process of his autobiography, and Ted will speak. I was born September 3rd. Oh, by the way, the title of the talk is how a poor student, mediocre student, how a mediocre student became Ted Eager. I was born September 3rd, 1930, in Michael Reese Hospital, Chicago, 84 years after Morton's 1846 discovery and demonstration of the anesthetic effects of diethyl ether. I arrived at life midway between today and that momentous discovery, a discovery that underlies my self-identity. At the time of my birth, anesthesia as a medical discipline had lived half its life, having changed modestly or not at all from the days of Wells, Morton, and Snow. Nitrous oxide and diethyl ether continued as the primary general anesthetics. Anesthesia adjustments were based on patient's response as described by Snow's degrees of anesthesia, or Goodell's later signs and stages of anesthesia. Waters had just established the first department of anesthesiology. Most patients breathed spontaneously during anesthesia. Tracheal tubes were used rarely. The half century that followed completed the transformation of anesthesia from art into a discipline based on science. My family structure tracked the social norms of the day. My father, Edmund, was the family breadwinner. He founded an advertising agency, C&E, Crittenden and Eager, which he eventually ran as the chief executive and sole director. Earlier in his life, he dreamed of being a physician. He enrolled in medical school at the University of Chicago, but withdrew after one semester of a peculiar neurosis. He feared fainting when asked a question in class. My parents could afford me to send me to the Hyde Park School for Little Children at the age of 3. I remember developing an intimate relationship with Dick and Jane, dazzled by the connection between the language I spoke and the written word. It pleased me to find that the collection of letters had meaning. In addition to the library's children's books, my classroom held a child-sized cardboard house with chairs for 3- and 4-year-olds. The little house was the prize for the child who finished the lessons first. It was invariably mine to claim, the longest winning streak of my life. I often visited my grandmother Sophie in her nearby apartment. Sophie, a retired school teacher, supplemented my arithmetic lessons. She taught me multiplication tables and the magic of the factor of 10. To a young child, 12 by 12 seemed hard. Sophie taught me to reduce the hard problem to 2 easy ones. 12 times 10 plus 12 times 2. 120 plus 24. 144. How easy! Why isn't arithmetic taught this way? I entered the Charles Kosminski Public Elementary School as a stellar student. My preparation at the Hyde Park School for Little Children was good enough for me to skip kindergarten. I could probably have skipped more than that as I was reading at a 7th grade level. However, for reasons not clear to me even now, I rapidly sank to the bottom of my class. Perhaps it was because I was about 1.5 years younger than my classmates. Regardless of the reason, I remained stuck in academic doldrums for a decade. I failed courses repeatedly. I could not describe the structure of a sentence. I failed to understand fractions. I did not comprehend science. I failed nearly everything except Mrs. Ray's class in art. Dear Mrs. Ray, did I ever adequately thank you? Despite terrible academic performance, my teachers dutifully passed me from grade to grade. The issue was not that I rebelled against learning, quite the contrary. I read and read. I read books on mythology, fairy tales, stories of animals, Lassie Come Home, Call of the Wild. One of my present treasures is a copy of English fairy tales, a book of bloody stories that I stole from our school library. A book whose cover disintegrated and years later was lovingly replaced by my eldest daughter, Chris. I lost myself in these images where boys and men were masters and adventurers. I loved comic books, learning the word bizarre from Superman. I discovered the world of science. Books on chemistry and physics and medical heroes appeared on my bookshelf adjacent to Superman and Lassie. I devoured books by Paul de Crieff about physician scientists who conquered disease and famine, particularly the microbe hunters, hunger fighters, and the men against death. I had dreams of becoming one of them, Robert Koch or Ignaz Semmelweis, performing simple experiments with results that saved thousands of lives. De Crieff made it sound so easy. Even a country physician like Koch could become a great scientist. And of course, it would please my father for me to have become a physician. My mother defended me, her genius son, for my failures at school. I overheard her argue with a teacher that I couldn't possibly be incompetent at fractions. She was wrong. I was an exemplar for incompetency. However, she made little effort to understand or correct what had gone wrong after my graduation from the Hyde Park School for Little Children. She did get a tutor who taught me Spanish and helped me pass the next year of that subject, but just barely. I abandoned Spanish and took up French, got equally poor grades. Good Lord, why did I think French would be easier than Spanish? I ended my first semester in junior high school with 3 Ds, that's science, algebra, and English, and an F in Spanish. The Ds were probably gifts. I did not seem to have the capacity for memorization that each class required. Despite the D in science, I liked the chemistry books I read. I also liked making explosives. I learned how to mix nitrates and sulfur to wondrous effect, pursuing experiments that nearly destroyed our house. I didn't get low grades in every class. Mrs. Olmsted lived in sin, yes, even in the 1940s, Mr. Olmsted, got to get the genders right here. Mr. Olmsted lived in sin with Mrs. Minnie Moore, a diminutive teacher of geometry famous for odd things. Against the rules, the boys might toss a football in the hall. Coming from nowhere and jumping far beyond her 5-foot height, Mrs. Moore would intercept the pass and disappear with the ball. Her geometry became a revelation. Until the second year of high school, I had assumed that all problems could be reasoned to a solution, not understanding that memorization was required, which explains my failure to pass Spanish and other courses. For reasons now lost, I memorized the basic theorems of geometry, the limited number of fundamental principles from which the entire subject derived. Perhaps I remembered them because the principles were so few. Perhaps I remembered them because I intuited that they were fundamentally true and was drawn to the righteousness of those principles. I then discovered to my amazement that everything in geometry could be deduced from these principles. Reason could guide me to a correct solution, a joy. Mrs. Moore gave me a rare A grade. I don't know if the pleasure arose from her gift of geometry or geometry's elegance, but I suspect the latter. The pleasure of learning can go too far. By the time I reached college, I had come to love mathematics, getting grades of A in every course I enrolled. I took a course in algebra just for fun, acting each examination, expecting an easy A, but no, I got a B. Why? I asked the teacher, a beautiful, voluptuous woman who had made mathematics her life. because, she says, you didn't take it seriously. She was right, but I'm getting ahead of the story. In high school, I noticed an increasing interest in girls. But that's not part of this story. I'm going to keep going. Several pages elapse. At age 13, I entered Hyde Park High School, discovering that chess and checkers were among the sports offered. Sports. I, this timid weakling, could win an athletic letter. My algebra teacher, Mr. Olmsted, mentioned the Chess and Checker Club. I joined the checker enthusiasts, a distinct minority of the club members. Quickly, I established myself as the best checker player in the club. I became captain of the vaunted Hyde Park High School checker team. Although my grades were dismal, I graduated at the bottom 20% of my high school class. I led the team to the All-Chicago Checker Championship 2 years running. Thereafter, 2 plaques commemorating our triumphs line the school wall. They may still be there today. I did receive an athletic letter for this success, adding to my sense I could do something well. I had an epiphany in my junior year in high school. My buddy, Ralph Fertig, suggested we earn pocket money at Malling's Shoes. Malling's was one of the many low-priced stores in the south side of Chicago, catering to poor, mostly black women. We applied to Malling's with no experience and were immediately accepted in the short labor market of the 1940s. My first day, I discovered what many shoe salesmen know. Women enjoy shoe shopping more than shoe buying. My first day, I helped many ladies enjoy the pleasure of trying on new pairs of footwear, but I didn't sell many shoes. My 8 or 10 hours of work left me exhausted. Selling shoes was hard work for little money. I easily connected the trajectory of my academic career with selling shoes. If I didn't improve academically, I might spend my life at Malling's. That wouldn't do. At this aha moment, an epiphany of an academic slouch, I resolved to change my directory. I was poorly positioned to make that change. I had an atrocious academic record. I knew little about the best approaches to study, how to take notes in class, or even what classes to take. I could not get into most institutions of higher learning because of my academic record. And the year, 1946, millions of soldiers returning from World War II sought to reestablish their lives by applying to college. Northwestern University, the University of Chicago, and the University of Illinois rejected my applications. The rejection from the University of Chicago galled my father, who noted that all the eagers had completed college there with honors. Dad had his Phi Beta Kappa as proof, and he had been generous in his contributions to the university endowment, but it made no difference. My dismal record spoke too loudly. But a local community college, Roosevelt College, accepted my father's check and me. I enrolled there, highly motivated by carrots. I'd like to be a country physician, and sticks. I did not want to sell shoes. Ralph went as well. I don't know why. Ralph had better qualifications than I. Having never learned how to study, I studied inefficiently. I compensated by studying for longer hours than any sane student would spend. The summer before school, I prepared for classes I would take, reading and rereading the required books. When school began, classes and studying became my life. I slept 4 to 6 hours a day, ate meals, and studied. I studied every day, including holidays. To develop better note-taking skills, I took a course in an offbeat shorthand. It worked, and to this day, I still take notes in shorthand. I was not a brilliant student, but I was a persistent one. Years later, I came across a marvelous comment on persistence by an average president, Calvin Coolidge. I had been lucky. By chance, hitting on persistence, probably the best approach to study that I could apply. The D's and F's of grammar school and high school became A's in my year at Roosevelt. Armed with A's, the following year I applied and was accepted at the University of Illinois. Chicago and Northwestern still rejected me. The success did wonders for my self-image. Success in school at Roosevelt, my 3 years at the University of Illinois became an addiction. I spent my last 3 years at the University of Illinois, where school and grades were the purpose of my life. I was single-minded in purpose, driven by the carrot of respected career and the stick of not wanting to sell shoes. There was no uplifting joy in learning, no transcendental beauty in knowledge. It was just school and grades. I chose a major in chemistry and a minor in mathematics. I attended class 12 to 15 hours each day, with an additional 8 to 12 hours of study after class. That adds up to more than 24 hours a day, but that's what it felt like. I got a B in my first physics test. Therefore, I slept less. I would overcome less than perfect grades by working harder, studying longer. Early one morning, I found myself holding a ringing alarm clock, trying to connect time, velocity, and acceleration, my mind unable to stop the ringing. But on to the examination, where I scored 100, the only student to do so in our class of 600. Thank God for all those returning veterans. I called home triumphant. My father wasn't impressed. That came later. I clawed at school, this frightening foe that had to be overcome if I were to become a physician. But school had morphed into more than a mere barrier to my becoming a physician. I had to overcome this foe to believe in myself. Bring it on! And I succeeded. I worked around the clock. I went to school year-round and ignored holidays, all seasons. I won A's and an occasional B, the one in algebra, and then 3 of them in German. The reward, the sense of triumph was wonderful. With awards in hand, a Phi Beta Kappa now, my father's a bit more impressed, I graduated at age 20, in the top few percent of my class. My first year at Northwestern Medical School passed easily, in part because my pre-medical courses in biochemistry gave me a leg up. However, courses that required memorization, like anatomy, were a challenge. Sometimes I would resort, sometimes for the wrong reason. The brilliant tyrant, Lowell Davis, the chair of surgery, taught the freshman course in correlative anatomy. The final examination consisted of a single question. A boy dove into Lake Michigan. When he rose to the surface, he could not move his upper or lower extremities. What caused this? This was a simple question with a simple answer. The boy had struck his head, fractured his cervical spine, and transected his cervical spinal cord. In an instant, he had become quadriplegic. End of story. But wait, consider that winter had come to Chicago. On the surface of Lake Michigan floated cakes of ice. Additionally, the question states that the boy rose to the surface. Clearly, the ice wasn't very thick. When ice is thick, and it can be very thick, you might as well try diving through cement. The boy would have been on the surface of the lake. Obviously, the question was posed in a way to see if I realized the ice was too thin to actually pose a risk of injury. I took the facts at hand, gave a simple, possible, and wildly wrong answer. The boy froze. I imagine Davis reading my answer and thinking, God, did this kid not learn anything? He's putting me on. Although terribly off the mark, the answer could have been correct. If Davis had a sense of humor, he might have thought my answer was unintentionally clever. He didn't have a sense of humor. Nonetheless, he passed me. My decision to pursue anesthesia as my life's work came suddenly, in a single day, in the summer between my first and second years at Northwestern. Before medical school, I envisioned becoming a general practitioner. I wanted to become Robert Koch, a country physician making great medical discoveries. But I changed my mind. Like many medical students, I switched to anesthesia for money and power. I needed to earn money for my tuition and looked for a paying summer job. But what job? Lowell Davis believed anesthesiology was unworthy. But that didn't deter about 10 of my classmates from applying for anesthesia clerkships. They would be preceptees, learn the trade, be paid for their work. Yikes, none of us knew anything about anesthesia. The audacity and stupidity of that choice still makes me tremble today. But the experience sounded interesting. It would help pay the bills, so I too applied. I had the good fortune to be accepted by 2 anesthesiologists who worked at Grant Hospital in Chicago, and I learned to be splendid teachers. I arrived for work on a sunny day in 1952, dressed for the operating room, sat at the head of the operating table on which lay a patient for some minor procedure. Dr. Gittleson inserted a steel needle, no plastic needles, and delivered a solution of thiopental. I was instructed to deliver a combination of oxygen and nitrous oxide via a black rubber mask. The mask was connected to a circle absorbing system, and a rubber bag revealed the patient's breathing and rhythmic contractions. At this juncture, Dr. Gittleson was called from the room, and I was left alone to tend to the patient. The thiopentol flowed, the bag contracted and expanded, and I held the black mass to the patient's face. As the seconds moved, the bag moved less and less. It eventually stopped moving altogether. I knew little of anesthesia, or medicine for that matter, but I did know that breathing was good and not breathing is bad. I told the surgeon the patient had stopped breathing. He would have been his rights to tell Dr. Gittleson to get back in the room. But he asked, do I want to do artificial ventilation? And I said, yes, please. So he squeezed the chest while the circulating nurse fetched Dr. Gittleson. When he returned, he pointed that I could have compressed the bag itself to breathe for the patient. It goes both ways, you see. The remainder of the day passed on eventually. At the day's end, I sat in the locker room, slowly dressing, stinking of the sweat of terror that stayed with me throughout the day. And I thought, you could have killed a patient today. And if you decide on a career in anesthesia, you can do that every day. Every day. Take a patient's life in your hands. This was a life-changing epiphany. Anesthesia is power. For me, this was like offering candy to a child. My inner power freak wrote. The notion that I would follow the steps of Robert Koch or Ignatius Semmelweis vanished, replaced by a new dream. So my career was shaped by two epiphanies a decade apart. I didn't want to be a shoe salesman, and I wanted to be an anesthesiologist. Thank you.